I have that one that'll capture you.
Okay.
Just in after this then. But,
Yes. Body voice.
there's going to be a number of other folks joining us who are on fire right now. But as that wraps up, they will come in here. But I did want to record this session both for people watching later. And I think Carol's joining us right now, but I know some other people might zoom in. So, Kate, thank you for being here on some short notice. Reached out earlier this week, but given some of the realities that people are experiencing in this community and elsewhere, I think it's important to highlight some of the good work that you guys are doing and to help provide some guidance, resources, thoughts, and conversation on this topic. So, thanks.
Pleasure. So I'm Kate Good, Executive Director of the PRC. I think I know most of you, but in case I'm not a friendly face. And I'm going to give you an overview of sort of where things are at this week. You'll note that in a slide later, you'll see that this is the slide deck was created on the 7th, and things keep shifting. So what I say today may be completely different in 2 weeks. But we are fortunate in the work that we do, that we work with a lot of immigration attorneys who give us almost weekly updates on what's happening and what legislation is changing, sometimes daily updates. So that's where this information is coming from. I'm going to go through some detail. None of it really is that pertinent in many ways, but I think it's just helpful to get a sense of sort of what's going on. And interrupt me at any point with questions, because it's a lot of information. So we've been around since 1976, as you may remember. We do a lot of work in food insecurity and providing trainings. And we also do bookkeeping. And out of that bookkeeping work, we first started getting involved in immigration by being a fiscal sponsor for a group of folks who are raising money to post bonds at the York Detention Center, which is now closed. But we learned a tremendous amount through that work and about the need. And so at the suggestion of a number of the attorneys we worked with, we began to explore what it would look like for us to become a recognized organization under the Department of Justice to provide immigration legal services. So that is the space that we're currently in. We're in the middle of that recognition process. We hope that the recognition process still exists in a number of months, but we're also working closely with attorneys who are at Church World Service. They are in the one funded legal program at Church World Service that continues. So our initial plan had been to partner with CWS, but as their staff was primarily furloughed for the next 60 days, we are now just working with individual attorneys. So as I mentioned, we started working in bonds in 2019. And we then, as COVID hit, did some quarantine work with ICE. We were the first quarantine site in the US to get set up. I spent a bunch of COVID explaining to folks how to do that all around the country. And we did a lot of resettlement work, whether that was getting folks into a short-term placement or a long-term placement. And out of that work, as I mentioned, we learned that having access to legal status and having access to an attorney or accredited representative was really critical to success in folks' immigration cases. Immigration is a civil part of our judicial system. It is not a criminal part of our judicial system, so you have no right to an attorney.
Can you say that again, please?
So immigration is part of our civil system, legal system. It is not part of the criminal legal system, so you have no right to an attorney.
One will be provided for you.
That is correct. Yeah. So if you are charged with a crime in the US, you have the legal right to have an attorney, a competent attorney represent you, even if you can't afford one. That is not the case in the immigration legal system. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown. Last time I was here, we went through these, but I think it just really helps to remember the differences because it is a very confusing system. So refugees are folks who apply for their status outside of the US. They enter the US with their status decided. The UN is the entity, and another one or two agencies, like NGOs, decide who qualifies for refugee status, so it's not determined by the US. And then the US sets the quota for the number of refugees that we're willing to accept every year. That is the case for countries around the world. And then they enter the US after being processed by the US State Department. Asylees can only apply for asylum after entering the US. That is a little different right now, although that again has changed. It used to be that you could apply for asylum outside of the US in the Mexico border region using an app. That app has gone away. They enter the, yes.
So if they're here inside this, they're here illegally then?
No, excuse me. Every once in a while I inhale and swallow at the same time and it doesn't go well. When they arrive at a port of entry, they can say, I'm here to apply for asylum. And once that paperwork is processed, they have the legal status of somebody who's working on achieving asylum. So they have a legal status in the US. After 180 days, they are able to get a work permit. They have access to some state and federal benefits.
So can you give me an example of how that would look? I mean,
Sure. So everything is backed up currently because of COVID. But an example is friends of mine have had a Cameroonian woman staying with them for the last 6 years. She arrived in the US, applied for asylum at the airport where she landed. She then had a sponsorship, which was a local congregation who said to ICE, like, we're willing to take responsibility for her basic needs so that she will not be a burden on the system, which is actually a legal technical term. The church needed some additional assistance, and so she moved in with friends of mine because she was expecting a child and needed that kind of support. Her case was heard for the first time, so this was 6 years ago. Her case was heard for the first time last year, and her final decision was rendered last month. So during that entire time, she was legally in the US. She has been working the entire time. She sends money back to her family in Cameroon. And until her status was determined, ICE couldn't have picked her up and detained her.
so when she landed, she had things in place.
Yep. Well, when you land, you can say, I would like to apply for asylum as you're being processed through customs.
But she had a congregation or some people that were
Yes.
gonna,
Yes.
she already knew that before she landed.
Yeah. One of the things that's critical often is for somebody to have a sponsor or somebody who's willing to take responsibility for the person who arrives.
No, this is gonna be another category, but what about undocumented immigrants?
So undocumented immigrants are people, and I will advance.
Okay.
Here, let's get there.
All right.
It's primarily folks who've overstayed a visa in the US. So we have the image of people crossing the southern border, but most people who are undocumented in the US overstayed a visa. That could be a tourist visa, a student visa, so they entered the US legally, they had gone through their consulate and gotten the visa they needed. And then when that visa timed out, they stayed. Well, some people, and this is sort of the image that we have from the news or from the political rhetoric, is people who enter the country without inspection. So that means that they entered the US without going through Customs and Border Patrol, without having their passport scanned, without having a visa to enter the US. So that is normally people who are undocumented fit into one of those two categories. They do not have access to legal status, so they cannot legally work. They can't legally receive benefits. A lot of them set up what's called ITINs, or a tax ID number, and they pay taxes. So they pay taxes into the US system, but do not actually receive any benefits from the US system. So did I get close to answering your
Yeah,
question?
no, you did, thank you.
Okay. So the folks, refugees, legal status, they're on their way to getting a green card within a year in the US, and then they can apply for citizenship within 7 years after that green card has been issued. Asylees, if they are determined to receive asylum, which is about 40% of the people who apply for asylum receive asylum, then they have a legal path to at least a green card. Those are the primary ways towards receiving long-term status in the US outside of family-based immigration. So that is, you have somebody in your family who's already a US citizen or a green card holder, and they can sponsor you as a family member. So it's immediate family members, children's partner or spouse and parents.
And once they're here, they're both in a similar category?
Once they're here, so folks who apply for for citizenship because of a family-based connection, they go through their consulate and enter the US with a legal status. And then are in the process of applying for a green card. Green card processing for Mexico, they're processing applications, I think that were last submitted in 1990, so it takes a long time, but they're here legally the entire time. So an LPR, a lawful permanent resident, we know that by the name green card. The most common route, as I mentioned, is for family preference immigration, meaning that you have an immediate family member who is a US citizen. And as I mentioned, I was wrong, 1999. 2001 is the current wait time for, Mexico has the longest wait. But there are other countries that also have substantial waits. And then you may be familiar, especially from the last election, with temporary protective status. There are currently 17 countries which this applies to. So you have to have arrived by a specific date. And if you are Haitian and arrived since 1993, depending on the time slot, you have a legal status, but there's no path to a green card or citizenship. You are here until the US government decides that they are going to let your TPS lapse, and you can work, but you have very limited benefits. For instance, the Trump administration did not renew Venezuela's TPS status, and so about 350,000 people will be eligible for deportation in April and September. That's when there are different categories of TPS lapse.
So they're, like, these Mexican people have been here since 1999
Yep.
legally.
Because they're waiting for a green card.
That's correct.
So they have TPS.
No,
Well,
they
No.
have a legal status that is pending a green card.
They don't have a green card.
They don't until their application is processed, and a lot of people just hope that they're alive when their application is processed.
And can they work during?
Oh,
that?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
They're in a long line.
I'm sorry.
They're in a long line.
Yeah, but they're here, they have all their paperwork and they can do everything, including receive benefits.
So what does a green card do?
It makes you adjacent to a US citizen. You have a lot of legal protections. You can still be deported if you would, commit a substantial crime. But you have all the legal protections of a US citizen, except that your status is a little bit more nebulous in that you are not a US citizen, so you don't receive all of the protections of citizenship, but most of them. Lots of folks have green cards. If I have friends who are Canadian that have worked in the US for 20 years and they have green cards because they don't want to give up their Canadian citizenship. So sometimes folks would prefer to be on a green card than change their citizenship. We talked about visas and we talked about being undocumented.
Do you have statistics for how many people overstay their visas opposed to how many people are coming across the border without going?
I'm not sure. We have seen substantial, so here are the statistics I do have. 14 million immigrants in the US in 2024 without legal status is 8.4 million, or with TPS is 5.6 million. I'm not sure. We have seen a diminished, and part of it is tracking undocumented folks is really challenging because they are by intention not on anyone's radar. But we have seen border crossings drop substantially in the last number of years. So I think we have this stereotype of people like invading from the South, but a lot of times it's folks who entered in through an airport or a train. So we have 2.6 folks who are waiting an asylum claim. The temporary permission would include folks who have parole, which we'll get into in a sec, or DACA. So the temporary permission is a number of different things that can be revoked. So if your asylum claim is denied, you are on track to be deported. If your TPS lapses, you're on track to be deported. DACA is a very nebulous category, and we're seeing a lot of folks age out of DACA. Other deferred action, that can be any number of things. And then humanitarian parole under Biden was a whole new category that developed for Afghans and Ukrainians primarily, although there are folks also from Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, and Haiti who also are here on parole. Parole is a 2-year program. There's no path to any other legal status, and there's no guarantee of renewal.
Would the people that are applying for a green card fall under the,
Temporary status?
yeah,
Yeah, although if they've been cleared to get a green card, then they essentially have a green card. They just haven't gotten processed yet. So they're not carrying the green card, but their status is less temporary than somebody who's here with PPS.
And the number of people coming over the border from Canada is much less than the
Correct.
people coming from.
Yes.
And how much less? I mean, is it?
Oh,
significant?
like, don't quote me on this, but it's like substantially less.
And the number of people coming over the border from Mexico over the years has been pretty, everyone has that the problem, or does it go down?
It goes down. I mean, it was basically stopped during COVID, and it has not returned to the level it was pre-COVID. Yes.
The country origins of the people that are coming through Canada would
Yes.
be similar to the ones coming from Mexico?
Well, I think the important thing to remember about Mexico is it's not always Mexicans.
Exactly, yeah.
So you're seeing a lot of Chinese come across the border. You're seeing a lot of West Africans and come across the border. Places that have substantial conflict, they may fly to a Central American country and then walk north. So we actually, in the bond work we did primarily work with West Africans. So Mexicans, in part because their economy has been doing better, and violence is diminished, there's less migration north.
So similar nationalities coming from both directions.
I think so. Some Canadians try and cross the border without documentation. I had a weird situation during the Trump administration last time where a family accidentally crossed into the US. They did not intend to. I think they were British. They were visiting Canada on a visa, accidentally drove across the border and were detained by ICE and held in detention. They had an infant. It was a terrible case, but it was just like they didn't mean to. So these weird things happen too, often at the Canadian border because it's a little bit less clear where the border is sometimes, depending on where you are. So, yes.
Every road from Canada coming across the border, there's a border patrol there.
Not necessarily. That's where I think some straying happens, not intentionally necessarily. The Mexican border is more hard, but you can cross some water areas, although Texas has really worked at prohibiting that.
So in Canada, if you knew where to go, you could drive from the United States without ever seeing it.
Probably,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, you're still at risk because ICE is, depending on the administration. So typically enforcement happens within 100 miles of the border. That has typically been the enforcement space for ICE. We're seeing that change, but I think anytime you're within 100 miles of the border, you're in greater jeopardy of ICE just appearing and wondering what you're doing. And to be clear, Canada has firmed up its immigration policies too. So going north without clearing customs is also not a great idea.
You mentioned Mexico. How about other countries like Guatemala and Honduras?
Yep, El Salvador.
Yeah,
Yep.
are they a large
Yeah,
percentage of those coming through?
a lot of Venezuelans and a lot of Cubans, because they have almost no path to a future in either country. El Salvador has really, the violence and gang activity is really diminished. It's a whole other topic of whether you think the diminishment was done well. But some of the Central American countries that had a lot of violence in the mid 2000s, that has shifted as they've had more totalitarian governments that have just imprisoned large groups of people who they think have relations to gangs. So that has, I won't stray into my thoughts on Central America policy. That's a whole other topic, but that has cut down on the violence, so people are more likely to stay. Sure.
A little while ago, you said those who age out of DACA.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting the age, but what does that mean? What does it mean legally, or what does that mean about someone's status if they age out of?
That's a
DACA's
giant
so
mess.
fluid anyway.
Yeah, DACA's a giant mess, and it's not a large group of people. As you may have seen, it's, 540,000 people approximately. As they've gotten older, they have more opportunity. They may have children who are now old enough to sponsor them for citizenship. They may have decided that they had an opportunity for schooling here and now have moved somewhere else. Their family situation may have changed. So it's a small group of people. It's an incredibly fluid situation, but at the moment, they can remain in the US, but they can reach a certain age where they're no longer part of the DACA categorization.
And then they're illegal.
Undocumented. So we use the word illegal, but remember, this is part of the civil part of US law. So it's not actually, there's no criminality in it because it's civil. So we use the word illegal, and I don't mean to
Right,
pick on
right,
you,
yeah, I understand.
because it makes it sound like, somebody has broken the law coming into the US and not passing through, Customs and Border Patrol, but they have not created a criminal act. They have not committed a criminal act. So it's sort of a standalone space where the worst thing that happens to you if you are somebody here without documentation or legal status is that you're either deported back to your country of origin, or in the worst case scenario, you're detained in the equivalent of a prison, but not because you've done something illegal, but because we can't deport you fast enough. So the immigration system is extremely backlogged. Nothing moves quickly, but you couldn't be sentenced to state prison, for instance, or federal prison.
And remind me what DACA refers to.
Deferred action. Sorry, does somebody else remember? I have done lots of studying of this, but I can only remember DACA.
Is it child?
Yeah, children. It's children who came as very young children into the US with their parents. They have lived in the US their entire lives. They have no connections back to their country of origin, but they are not in the US as a documented person.
And
Deferred
their,
action for childhood arrivals.
Yes.
and
yes.
their parents came undocumented.
Correct. Yes, but it's a difficult situation because a lot of times they have, they were born in Honduras, but they have never lived there. They may not speak Spanish. As I said, we did this on February 7th, so things may have changed. For instance, things that changed this week, the birthright citizenship order has been blocked indefinitely. The judge was not kind in his ruling. It's bad lawyering is what they've said. A lot of people don't think that this is going to become a change in our law, but what they are concerned about is that it will give the administration an opportunity to do other much more vindictive acts, like creating a migrant camp at Guantanamo Bay, for instance. And as you may have heard, some of the legal nonprofits that work in immigration law received a cease and desist letter and had their federal funding stopped. Some of that has now been rescinded, some of it has not. So legal orientation programs, for instance, and other programs that provide information and guidance to immigrants dealing with deportation, that has been refunded and they are able to continue their work for now. So TPS is one of the things that I think is just really helpful to talk briefly about. And just to be clear, all of this is super technical. Essentially, my point is to say a lot of this is nebulous and changing. And so if you're working with somebody or know somebody who is in the US and on a temporary status, it's really important to encourage them to talk to a lawyer, take every step they can to protect their status, because all of this is changing. The one thing I would say is that temporary statuses are dictated by DHS or the Department of Homeland Security and the executive branch of the government. So they're nebulous. Parole, TPS are at the whim of the executive branch and DHS. Asylum is part of our court system. It is enshrined in law. That is much, much harder to get rid of. So if somebody is here temporarily, their TPS may go away, but if they have an asylum application pending, they are here legally with documentation, and it will take 2 or 3 years for their application to be processed. So we see a lot of folks who are here on TPS applying for asylum right now because it gives them a better shot of staying in the US. As I mentioned earlier, Venezuelans receive TPS, and that has since been canceled and will expire in April and September. TPS remains in place for the other 16 countries, and folks can work and are protected from deportation, but if it's not renewed, all of that shifts.
Is there any reason to think how likely or unlikely those renewals will be?
I think that
Did
if
Venezuela happen for a specific reason, or like, did it, like, time-wise, did it just come up, or was that
It
just
just
on the
came
chopping
up.
block?
and some people think that they just didn't, they missed the deadline accidentally.
Right.
Some people think that TPS is just gonna keep expiring for folks. Because if you want to show progress in deporting folks, there aren't many folks who are here who created who were in state or federal prison and now are up for deportation. That has been the primary folks who are deported currently under the Trump administration. But how do they find more folks to deport when they've promised to deport as many people as possible? They let the temporary statuses lapse. So it's likely that parole and TPS will be most challenged.
And why would someone get a TPS status?
Because they're not, because they fall into a category of a country that the US believes, for instance, with Haiti. I mean, Haiti's why TPS exists. And Haitians have been in the US since 1993 legally with TPS because the US doesn't believe that they can return to their country of origin and it's a safe place. So the intention is to keep migration, undocumented migration, to a minimum because they believe that people who are in Haiti are going to try and leave Haiti because of all, both the natural and political disruptions that have happened. And so if they can manage folks coming into the US, give them work permits and the opportunity to be productive in the US, then they're less likely to be here as undocumented folks. But
Knowing they're gonna be here anyways, let's make it.
correct, yeah. But if Haiti would suddenly turn the corner and it would be a safe, productive place for people to return to, they would allow TPS to lapse with the understanding that, hey, it's great to go home now. So the intention is not to keep folks here forever, but to just keep them while they need support and are not designated a refugee status.
And Ukraine would be another example.
Yes, although Ukraine is parole. And parole
So
is,
complicated.
yeah.
Thanks, Kate.
No, I'm sorry, because there's no easy way to talk about this, and you just probably leave being like, I'm even more confused. Parole is a 2-year program that the Biden administration, it has existed for years, but the Biden administration used it in a very particular way, first for Afghans and then for Ukrainians, because they believe that Congress would not extend TPS to them or give them any other way of moving them out of a really difficult situation. The UN doesn't move quickly, so refugee status was not going to be an option for a number of years. And so this was a way of getting folks out of war zones into the US when the US had a particular role in that foreign conflict. And they don't know what's next.
Of course, people would say, well, other countries should be doing their part.
Well, and other countries are doing their
And I
part.
think
Poland
they
has
are.
hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians come in. Yes.
Germany's in trouble politically because of it.
Yes, 1 million Syrians under Merkel went into Germany, and that has given rise to the far right. So parole is temporary. You can apply for a work permit. You can't be deported on parole. As I had mentioned earlier, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuelans can work in the US if they don't qualify for TPS. But the parole for these countries has ended. so that it's not being renewed and those folks have to figure out another status or go home. So normally that would mean applying for asylum. And they also have removed some of the things that make it easy to be a sponsor or help somebody move forward with a parole application. So that makes it seem like parole is likely on the chopping block for everyone. There's some case by case options for parole, but that has been how it's been for years. And so it's not a likely program to continue in the way it did for several years. I'm going to keep moving because there's a lot to get to, but I will keep it as simple as possible. As I mentioned, interior enforcement has typically been about 100 miles around the border. The concern is that interior enforcement is going to be increased. That's where you see folks raiding a meatpacking plant or other places where they believe folks are employing people who are undocumented. One of the things that has shaken people the most is the idea that there are no longer protected places or locations like churches and schools and hospitals. This is a major thing that we spend a lot of time dealing with because people don't know what to do.
And that's a change with this administration?
Correct.
And that was quote a legal place before, like a church was a legal refugee place?
Yeah, I think most administrations don't want to have photos of armed people carrying guns going into a church. It's a terrible PR issue. And so they have basically said, like, it's not law, but it's a bad idea to raid a church, a school, or a hospital.
Just so everybody knows, our congregation was a sanctuary
Yeah.
place back in the 70s, 80s.
Yeah. There's a lot of churches that have been.
So if ICE would go to this meat packing plant.
Yeah.
And they would just gather all the folks that they assume are undocumented there, unless they have a warrant for each individual, or how does that work?
It sort of is being sorted out right now. One of the things that is really being encouraged is to not do anything if there's not a warrant signed for a person or, an individual.
And that must be specific with that person's name on it,
Yes.
correct? Okay.
Yeah. So, and it has to be filled out correctly. So one of the things that has been the best stymie for ICE is to have people say nothing, to give no information, because they don't have to unless there is a signed warrant, bless you, for them. So, the administration just sued the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois because by conducting regular Know Your Rights trainings, they were stymieing the efforts of ICE. So I think one of the other things that I would just say is we are not at the mercy of all of this. There are ways to push back against this. And I think the worst possible thing we can say is this is happening to us and we're afraid and we give in. But instead, we are all fortunate, privileged people in this room. ICE is unlikely to ask us to see our documents. So to stand in solidarity with folks who are Black and brown and know that they may be targeted just because of their skin color is one of the strongest things that we can do, just in being a witness, being present, and offering good information to folks who have a need. One of the other things that's concerning is that there is expedited removal. This has been on the books for years, but rarely used. So DHS can remove immigrants at the US border who are unauthorized to be in the US without giving them a chance to present their case to a judge. So this is being expanded to anywhere in the US. We've not seen it used yet, but that's very concerning because it's really circumventing the rule of law in many ways. I would just really encourage, if you know somebody who's an immigrant, to really give them this information. They have the right to be silent. It is, they should, if possible, carry proof of having been in the US for 2 years. That can be doctor's records, school enrollment, any number of things. It doesn't have to be something outside of sort of an official document that would show, I was a patient of this doctor in the last 5 years. If they can prove and have proof of entering the US legally, that helps substantially. And anything pending, upcoming hearings, asylum applications, And then if you state that there's a fear of returning to your own country, you should not be detained. So it's not complicated, it's a burden and it's terrible, but there are ways of not having ICE just pick you up and detain you.
That would that keep them from picking them up if they said, I'm afraid of going back to my,
It should. It doesn't, I mean, this is assuming that ICE knows what they're doing. Yes.
And anybody who's documented would sort of know that, I mean, that they should be carrying stuff with them all the time.
Not always. I think one of the worst things right now is that there's just so much information and so much fear. Folks don't know what they can and can't do. And so I think that's where my hope today is that it's a lot of information, but there is legal status. There is things that there are things folks can do that keep them safe. So that's something that we want to focus on in the work that we're doing, because people are so afraid they don't know what they can and can't do.
When somebody is undocumented but has been here for 2 years,
Yeah.
is that a good thing then?
Yes. Yeah, it means that ICE is supposed to be removing folks who just arrived and who are in that 100-mile border area. If they're outside of that and have been here for more than 2 years, then they have the potential status and also like showing that they have long-term connections to this country.
I see online that there are appeals to us white privileged people to get in the way, including on a bus, stand up and say something if
Yeah.
this comes on the bus, that no one is obligated to say a word, just to get in the way.
Yep. Yep.
In a decent, civil, whole way.
Well,
And if we
yeah.
were on, closer to the borders, I would be calling for us to have training sessions
Yeah.
for us to know how to do this.
Well, I think there's still value in having these training sessions because I think a lot of us live with a sense of uncertainty and fear. It feels like things are out of control. And when you understand that there are things you can do that protect folks, I think that is really helpful.
And like, say you're on a bus like that, and someone comes on the bus, are you required to give identification if someone asks for it? Maybe you're just sitting there?
Not without a signed warrant.
So anybody could say, I don't want to show you ID, and they wouldn't be required to leave the bus if the guy was gonna arrest them unless there was a
Right.
warrant.
But it can also be to be able to show, like, I've been here more than 2 years. I have an appeal pending in my asylum case with limit the harassment that ICE can do too. Yes, ideally. Okay, so, am I done at 10?
15.
10:15?
Look at that bonus
Oh,
minute.
that's
I'm sure we'll have lots of questions.
So one of the things that we've been really working at in the last number of months is saying, you know, what are the primary needs? First, in the Lancaster County area, we don't ever want to reinvent the wheel because we're a small organization. We have 3 full-time staff. So what does it look like for us to do the best work that we can do, helping folks in the immigration space? We lucked out and we have quite a few volunteers who've gone through a training that Villanova offers that makes them eligible once they've gone through the DOJ process to provide legal support for persons who are undocumented. They are the equivalent in DOJ's eyes of an attorney. But we've also partnered, as I mentioned earlier, with an attorney and her husband. She has a lot of experience in detention and deportation work, and he has been the office manager for a law firm that worked in detention and deportation work. And they said, we really feel like this is a tremendous need and we'd like to do this with you as volunteers. So we have together formed the Pennsylvania Immigration Advocacy Clinic. You can see our logo there. The intention is to focus on the areas of law that are really needed right now. So that's asylum cases, pension cases, and deportation cases. We're doing everything for free. We will have a weekly clinic starting March 11 at St. John's Episcopal Church in Lancaster City. It's from 5 to 8. One of the things that we really learned from the last 3 weeks is that federal funding puts you in the crosshairs of the whims of any administration. So you can see your funding go way up and then you can see it go way down. So PRC is doing all the administrative support, all the work to make this happen. We are relying on volunteers, but we're also doing things like getting folks mail at our office because they don't have a permanent place of residence. Processing applications, we're looking to work with school districts to offer guardianship paperwork because we see a lot of folks whose parents are undocumented, but their children are US citizens. What does that mean if their parents are deported? And then we're also going to work on just educational and legal options, legal processes, and assistance for applications. So we have our first training February 15 from 9 to 10:30, either at PRC or on Zoom. And we're going to hold them then every, I think it's third Saturday going forward. And we just have a lot of needs. You may feel like, oh, I'm not a lawyer or I don't have legal training. That's fine. We need help with interpretation and translation, filling out paperwork, research, childcare. We promised St. John's that the place would look spotless after we leave, so cleaning. I will be there pushing them up. And then our hope is that we are able to set up a visitation program at Moshannon Detention Center. So York Detention Center closed. A number of other detention centers in states around us closed, and they opened a large detention center north of State College in the Moshannon Valley. It has 1,800 beds. York had about 700. One of the things that's really troubling is that ICE keeps moving their detention centers out of urban or populated areas to very rural areas where they are suddenly the primary employer for a town, which is the case for Phillipsburg. That gives them a lot of power. It makes legal counsel very challenging because it's hard to get there. So it just eliminates a lot of the support that immigrants need when they're detained. So we're working with folks in State College to see if we can have more of a presence there. That is at the whim of ICE. So we've had good success in the past. Who knows what's going to happen this time? We're also, and I have hard copies of this, we have a volunteer survey. There's no commitment in filling out the survey. It's just a way of us taking the first step and seeing what people's level of interest might be. So I have a QR code, but I also have physical copies of that too. So you've gotten questions in, but are there other questions? Because I've got time now.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I want to do is just say thank you
Oh, thank
so
you.
much for
This
taking the
is
time to lay this
confusing
out,
and complicated.
for letting us record this. I
Sure.
think will be helpful. And thank you for the work that PRC is doing.
Oh, thanks.
Have you received pushback from congregations or from, I don't know, government entities? I don't know. You mentioned, we know what happened with CWS and we
Yeah.
know that being in the crosshairs.
Yeah.
Have you felt like you were in that situation? And do you have any concerns about that moving forward?
We have not. I think we've tried to stay under the radar pretty carefully. We did that last time where it was like, we don't want newspaper stories. We don't, I've had reporters call and we're like, oh, no, thank you. Like, I don't want to be on NPR and then suddenly like, we're a big enough profile for people to make a splash when they
Correct.
scare us. The last time, nothing bothered me about the Trump administration in terms of my own personal safety. I think it feels a little bit more heightened this time around. It feels like there's sort of everything that feels a little, try not to be political about things. It feels like, yeah, it feels like nobody's quite sure where the beginning and end of things are. And so I think that makes us feel a little bit more like, oh, what does this mean? But I really feel like everything we're doing is legal. We're just giving people access to their legal counsel. And we try really hard to have it be something that feels apolitical. We believe that we are a country that, for whom the rule of law is important, and that's all we're trying to do. And my hope is that that's enough. Somebody asked me recently if we'll have security at the church. That feels like making us way too obvious. So hopefully being in a church and having a lot of just easygoing volunteers makes it just seem like another evening of work at a church.
So you don't have any concerns about people helping to spread the word about this event,
No,
about getting the word out
No.
for volunteers
Yep,
on
thank you.
social
Yep.
media, that kind of thing?
We've been,
Okay.
it's been shared broadly. We do have about almost 180 people showing up for the first training in person or by
That's
Zoom.
awesome.
So we feel really, we're actually just not sure where the chairs are gonna come from at this point. That's my biggest concern. We've moved it to another space in our complex, so we have enough room for everybody. But I think just the word of mouth, I think there is a level of visibility that also protects us. If we're totally underground and something happens, who knows? But if we're visible in the church space, then that protects us more.
And you're no longer on Good Drive or near Good Drive. You're down near,
Like next to Lancaster Mennonite.
not where the volleyball.
Yes, where
Yeah.
volleyball corner
Volleyball
was.
courts,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, but now we moved in, we had to renovate it because there were a lot of dressing rooms.
Okay.
Yes.
You receive any federal grant money?
We are an organization that's about $500,000 a year and we receive $8,000 in federal funding.
So does that tag you in any way?
It doesn't because it's actually food related. And if it would go away, we could continue to work. I think the problem and I don't want to speak for CWS. I know lots of folks at CWS have been really puzzled by. So CWS locally is run by CWS Global, which is a huge entity. Half of their funding came from the State Department. Resettling refugees is how they were reimbursed by the State Department. So with the lack of refugees and a lack of State Department funding, I think that really cut their capacity to do work. That's not how we've ever been structured, nor is that how we would structure this. And there's no judgment in that. They did amazing work and I hope they are able to continue. But our interest is being out of the realm of the whims of the federal government. Sure.
I think you mentioned earlier that most of the undocumented people in the United States came through illegal means first.
Correct.
Do you have any idea of percentages, like how many?
I don't, I mean, it's considered to be substantially more. Unfortunately, with folks being undocumented, they're not participating in normal sort of like census tracking and that kind of thing, especially the last census where there was a lot of concern about the questions that were being asked. But in general, I think we have one view of what immigration is, and it is actually quite different. Just overstaying, and somebody's in a relationship or they have a good job or they have some reason for staying.
And when we hear these numbers about people coming across the border, what does that represent? Number of people that were apprehended, number of people they saw, or how do they know like this many people came over the border?
It's often apprehensions. It would be a mix. I mean, ICE is spotting people and people may get through. It's harder and harder because the border, especially on the south, like Texas put stuff in the Rio Grande. I've had clients who come across through the Rio Grande previously. Now it's much harder for folks to cross that river. So I think it's just hardening a lot in the south, and that's increasingly diminishing people's efforts, but also I think just the word of mouth is not great. I will just say we have had clients who come with a coyote. If you want the worst possible scenario, that is it. They owe tens of thousands of dollars. They work 60 to 80 hours a week trying to make that money back, and their parents and family are threatened if they don't. So it is brutal.
When we were a sanctuary church back in the 80s, that's what happened.
Yeah,
But we're very much aware of all the coyotes that helped to bring
yeah,
the people across.
yeah. Since the 90s, Mexican immigration has really started to drop off. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But I think the stereotype of who is coming is really shifting. We're seeing a lot of folks from China, for instance. So it's sort of where people have the most pressure. You see more migration. It really just makes sense.
And how does the United States compare with other countries in terms of number of immigrants we've accepted or whatever?
Somebody asked me last time I was here if there's any country who's doing this well. And my answer is this is a fraught issue in any country that accepts immigrants. We have the opportunity here in terms of we're not a monolithic culture. Like we don't all look the same. We don't have the same expectations of, heritage and religion and language. So we are more welcoming to folks from other spaces, mostly because all of us are immigrants. US has been on the medium end of things. There are some countries that accept almost no immigrants. Some countries accept, like Germany did, like 1 million in a specific way. But I think what we've seen in Europe is both the ghettoizing of folks who come into the US or come into Europe, and then also the rise of the far right in response to folks who are Black and brown coming into their spaces. The US has not typically been that. We have a long history of treating immigrants terribly. In like the early part of the 20th century, we had less issues with immigration. I think it has just become a hot point for us again, and so we see immigration then go way down.
And when you say we're in the mid, whatever, is that total number or is that per
Total
capita?
number,
And per capita, how,
pretty low.
Yeah.
I think we normally accept well, refugees are 1% of immigrants in the US. So that gives you a ballpark sense of the number of people coming into our country and what refugees hold in that. And we have a very low quota for that. But then in terms of, we're in the middle of a large land mass, and so there's easy, also the European Union, if you hold an EU passport, you can migrate without it being, immigration in the same way. So we are just more susceptible to more immigrants. And I think people want to live here, which is a good sign, I think. So it's not a mark against us. Yeah.
So we are not very good at another language or anything. You still have
Oh, yes.
volunteer
Yep.
opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We have a lot of folks who are fluent in other languages, and we also have access to a translation line. So it's great if folks are fluent, but we also just have a lot of other needs too.
Some of us in this congregation are older. And it's just hard to get out there in the streets and do stuff and volunteer and stay up late. But we have financial resources.
Yes.
And when I say older, at a certain age, we have what's called required
Mhm.
distributions of our investments,
Mhm.
which, because we were prudent over the years, now we have enough.
Yeah.
And those required distributions have helped Joyce and I to be a lot more generous and give more than almost we've ever given in our life, because we've got to pay taxes on everything we don't give. And we have chosen not to give to the Red Cross and all the big name things that everybody else knows about and gives to. But we have a whole list of little things that we've known about because of personal contacts over the years, like empowerment of Black leaders in Harrisburg. I mean, I know a guy that's doing that personally. And an agency in Texas that our daughter lives in Waco and she's worked with DACA. We went to a fundraiser there and they provide legal status, free legal status to DACA people and all kinds of people that need legal help. And, that's an essential need. So we give to that every year. And there's, and the local library and the library in Lancaster that got defunded from everybody.
Yeah.
Well, we search those things out.
Yeah.
That's what we do.
Mhm.
And I just think we are capable of being discerning in our giving in
Yeah.
those ways.
Well, you make a huge difference in small organizations. As I mentioned, we're looking at $500,000 every year. We raise all of that money. We don't get reimbursed for things in a substantial way at all. And I think one of the things that we found is, if we have money for bonds, if we have money for legal fees, just filing paperwork can cost between $400 and $2,000. And one of the things we know is that it's likely those fees are going to go up substantially because that's another deterrent. Then we can, take that money. We have a fund for fees. We can take that money and we can give it to somebody who has a great asylum claim or needs an asylum claim and help them finish that part of their paperwork.
Are you a 501(c)(3)?
We are. Yep.
That's question.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yes.
I was late. So what organization do you work?
Parish Resource Center.
What's that again?
Parish Resource Center. We're a small nonprofit in Lancaster, just off of Route 30.
This is minimal, but you mentioned you were worried about 180 chairs this Saturday. That's
Yes.
coming up. How about parking? Because we're coming.
We actually have a giant parking
Okay,
lot.
all right.
That's one of the reasons we were like, we will ask people to carpool, but that should be, yes, thank you. We stood for a while the other day and just looked at the parking lot and counted spaces. Yeah, no, there's something very heartening about it, but we're also slightly overwhelmed. Well, you all have been extremely gracious with your time. Thank you. I've thrown an enormous amount at you. I think just the takeaway I would say is this is ever changing. The most important thing is to just soldier on. I think to the point that was made, local is the thing that makes a giant difference for folks. And, you know, I think there's just a lot of noise and chaos right now, and being a steady presence for people who are afraid is a huge gift to people.
We don't say soldier on in this. thing.
I'm Mennonite, so I'm really straight, but we march on.
Well,
Bands marching.
okay.
Alone.
I get a lot of immigration emails and they address them, dear comrade, and they say onward, so maybe that's the best.
Well, thanks, Kate. I would encourage folks, probably by the end of today, we'll have this up and available. If there are other people you want to make sure saw this or see this, Kate has generously agreed to bring greetings and worship too, so.
Thank you for having me. This
Thank you.
means a lot.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.